So let's now move on to disks. This is Van Hub. How's it go? Van Hub, right? When I first gave a talk about this in Netherlands, and I said that's Van Gogh, and then Hub corrects me. He says, no, it's Van Hub. Anyway, so Van Hoff has this beautiful picture of stuff. All right, so here is this beautiful idea by John Bjorkman. 1993. I go to Space Telescope, I hear this talk by John Bjorkman. You know, I tend to be very skeptical whenever I hear a new idea because most of it is usually not very well founded. But after I went back, I really, and the basic idea is when you launch material off of a star, it tends to want to stay in an orbital plane if it's being pushed out radially, conserving momentum, and that orbital plane often takes it and crosses the equator. And so that's basically the idea behind this model. And so Steve Cranmer again, so there's another illustration of the idea that it would tend to cross the equator, and it makes this thing we call the wind compressed disk. So Steve Cranmer is there, and then within a week or two, he reproduced the formalism that Bjorkman had, and then I go to the double S meeting, and I run into John Blondin, who's sitting in the back of the room there, being very quiet. But John, and I should have put down on the slide, I apologize, John. John gave me his VH1 code, one of the state of the art, at the time, a state of the art code, using piecewise parabolic. And we just turned on a rotating star. I had to play with the boundary conditions a lot because the star got oblique. But you turn on the star, you turn on the stellar wind, you turn up the speed, and look at this beautiful wind compressed disk. But it assumes purely radial driving. Okay, so we were happy, but then you start to look at this more carefully. It's not dense enough to really make the H alpha you see in BE stars. And then when you look at it, we thought, well, maybe if we spin it up and then put the gravity dark, it'll be brighter on the poles, it'll push material down on the equator, but it does exactly the opposite. Because when a star is rotating, it becomes oblique, and the flux vectors are away from the equator. So it's pushing things away from the equator. And then the other thing is that this is a slower wind because the gravity is weaker here. And this is a faster wind, and so the net gradient along the thing has a polar direction. And the net result is that you completely inhibit this thing called the wind compressed disk inhibition. So we managed to kill the most beautiful idea that Joe Castanelli really got mad at me for this. You know, he said, you know, why we shouldn't criticize each other. I said, what do you mean? You know, if it's science, somebody's going to have to figure this out at some point. If it doesn't work, if nature is the arbitrator, I agree we want to criticize each other's on a personal level, but the science we can't look at it critically, how can we make progress? So anyway, that was what happened. So now let's talk about how do we actually make disks. And Dominique's up back there about pulsation somewhere. Yeah, oh, there you are, Dominique. Okay, I met him last week at the XShoot meeting. And so I want to make some key points about how you make disks. All right. First of all, I had this idea going back to the time that, matter of fact, originally hired Rich Townsend to work on this problem, this so-called PDOME, pulsationally driven orbital mass ejection. And unfortunately, we got waylaid in a couple other areas, and we never published any real journal papers about this. But Dylan, at the time of the meeting on bright emissaries in London, Ontario, resurrected this idea. And basically you put in a pulsation, ejects material into orbit, and eventually the material settles down into a disk. It's very close to the Kepler orbital velocity. And this is for a star that's rotating at some large fraction. And we already saw in the reviews that were previous that we now think that BE stars are rotating pretty fast. I mean, they're at least 75% critical, but because of gravity darkening, it could be 95 something. And the closer it is to critical, the easier it is to launch a disk. Dominique made the comment last week that, well, you can even do it with less than that because you could have these rogue waves, but I think rogue waves are pretty rare. So you won't, in order to feed a stable disk, you got to have lots of these things. Then I had this idea way back in the early 2000s when I was the chair of the B star working group, that you could also have radiation forces on a disk. And so here's how it works. I mean, in a wind, the desaturation that occurs is by the radial velocity gradient. But there's no radial velocity in a disk. It's a stationary disk. But there's shear. The inner orbits are moving faster than the outer orbits. And if you have a photon that goes along from, not from the center, but from the limbs, it crosses a big velocity gradient. And that essentially desaturates the lines, and that makes there be a strong radiation force. And so many years later, when Dylan was this became his thesis. And he was my graduate student. And here's basically this is a figure that shows the this is the mass loss rate here, the ablation off the disk driven by line radiation. And this is the ratio. This is the radiation forces. You can see it's very strong on the surface, not so strong in the middle. So anyway, the idea here is that this explains BE stars being these so-called shell stars. When you're looking at it from the equator, you see evidence of this UV light wind being driven off of the disk. And, you know, it's kind of like QSOs. QSOs have the wind radiation coming from the disk itself. And I have many times, you know, I think with Achim, we talked a lot about disk winds. Daniel Proga came to see me back in the early 90s with Jim Stone and Janet Drew. And I told them how I would do this, but I just didn't have time to work on it. And there's lots more complications in disk winds. But I kind of always see as the road not taken. I could have been a contender, you know, I could have done something in this field, but you can't do everything. Now, the other thing that Dylan did was this amazing pre-thesis project where he basically did a series of models where you collide two stellar winds in 2 dimensions and increase the cooling, rate of cooling. And then you find that as the shock region becomes narrower, becomes unstable, you get this thin shell. And when the net result is that as you increase this cooling parameter, instead of getting more and more X-rays, you have this big jump, factor of 50. And it explains why very close binaries don't have very strong X-rays. Okay, how am I doing here?